America ignored the warning, not because it wasn't written down, but because it didn't sound urgent at the time. And if this kind of history matters to you, take a moment to subscribe, because this story isn't about the past. It's about patterns that repeat when people stop paying attention. From the very beginning, the people who built the United States were less concerned with optimism and more concerned with human nature. They didn't assume leaders would always be wise, or that citizens would always be informed. They assumed the opposite, that ambition would grow, that power would be tested, that division would come slowly, then all at once. When the American system was being designed, the founders were fresh out of a revolution. They had just fought a king, watched unchecked authority turn into abuse, and seen how easily people could be ruled. When fear and loyalty replaced accountability, men like James Madison openly argued that the greatest threat to any republic wasn't invasion, it was internal decay, not collapse from the outside, but erosion from within. That's why the system they designed feels slow, frustrating, and inefficient by design. It wasn't meant to be elegant. It was meant to be resistant. They warned specifically about factions, groups of people who cared more about winning than governing, more about loyalty than truth. Madison wrote that factions were inevitable, but dangerous when left unchecked. The warning wasn't dramatic. It didn't predict a single explosive moment. It described something far quieter. People slowly choosing sides, excusing behavior they'd once condemned, and defending power simply because it was theirs. That warning was read. It was debated. And then over time, it was dismissed as theoretical. Another warning focused on power itself. The founders understood that power doesn't usually arrive violently. It arrives gradually through convenience, through small exceptions, through people saying, just this once. George Washington understood this better than anyone. When he stepped away from the presidency voluntarily, he wasn't just making a personal choice. He was setting a precedent meant to outlive him. He believed that once people accepted permanent power, even from someone they trusted, they would struggle to take it back. The warning wasn't that leaders would demand control, it was that people would allow it. If this kind of perspective is making sense so far, subscribe now, because this story only becomes clearer as it moves forward. The warnings didn't stop with leadership. They extended to the public itself. The founders worried deeply about political apathy, about citizens disengaging once systems felt stable. They believed that freedom required maintenance, that rights only survive when people understand them, and they feared that comfort would eventually replace vigilance. That once people believed the system was unbreakable, they would stop protecting it. History shows how accurate that fear was. Most major American crises didn't begin with chaos. They began with confidence. Confidence that institutions would hold, confidence that norms didn't need defending, confidence that it can't happen here. Over time, those assumptions stacked on top of one another. Small warnings were ignored because they didn't feel like emergencies. And by the time consequences appeared, they felt sudden, despite building for years. Another warning involved language itself. The founders warned that when political disagreement turns into moral warfare, compromise becomes betrayal and restraint disappears. When every issue becomes existential, the system can't function as designed. Disagreement stops being productive and becomes personal. This wasn't a modern insight. It was a historical one, drawn from the collapse of earlier republics that mistook passion for principle. What makes these warnings uncomfortable is that they weren't abstract. They were based on observed behavior, on patterns seen in Greece, in Rome, in European governments that collapsed under the weight of ambition and division. The founders didn't believe America was immune. They believed it would face the same tests, just later. And that delay, they knew, would be the most dangerous part. If you're still watching, this is a good moment to subscribe, because what happens next explains why warnings are often ignored even when they're accurate. Humans respond to events, not trajectories. A slow decline doesn't trigger alarm. It normalizes itself. Each generation adjusts to slightly worse conditions and calls them normal. By the time a real crisis appears, people argue about when it started instead of how to fix it. That's why the most dangerous period for any system isn't during hardship. It's during stability. When problems feel manageable. When people believe someone else will handle it. The founders understood this, which is why they built friction into the system. Checks, balances, delays. and limitations meant to slow momentum before it became irreversible. But those safeguards rely on people choosing to respect them. Warnings fail when they become familiar, when they sound repetitive, when people confuse longevity with permanence. The American system has survived not because it's invincible, but because enough people at enough moments chose restraint over advantage. That choice has never been automatic, and it has never been guaranteed. Subscribe here if you believe history is more than trivia, because this next part matters. Every generation believes it's smarter than the last, more informed, more capable of managing power responsibly. The founders anticipated this arrogance. They assumed future leaders would believe the rules were outdated, that the warnings no longer applied. That confidence, they knew, would be the real test. America didn't ignore the warning all at once. It ignored it gradually, by postponing accountability, by excusing behavior for short-term gain, by treating principles as flexible instead of foundational. None of this was shocking to the people who wrote the warnings. What would have shocked them is how quietly it happened. History doesn't punish ignorance immediately. It waits. It allows small compromises to feel harmless. It rewards convenience. And then when consequences arrive, they feel sudden, despite being carefully earned. That's the part most people misunderstand. Collapse is rarely dramatic at the start. It's administrative, cultural, psychological. The warning was never meant to scare. It was meant to prepare. And preparation, unlike fear, requires discipline. It requires remembering lessons when they're no longer emotionally charged. That's why warnings are easier to ignore than disasters. Disasters force reaction. Warnings demand foresight. If this story changed how you see American history, subscribe now, because this channel exists to explain patterns, not promote panic. The lesson here isn't that failure is inevitable. It's that survival is conditional. The system works when people respect limits, when ambition is restrained, when disagreement doesn't erase legitimacy. America ignored the warning not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. And history shows us that the most important lessons are rarely dramatic. When they're given, only when they're needed,